Welcome and thanks to all who have gathered with us online today. My name is Vivian Lee, and I am the director of the Masters of Architecture program at the John H. Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design. I'm delighted to welcome you to the 2021-2022 Frank Gehry International Visiting Chair in Architectural Design public lecture with Lina Ghotmeh. First, I would like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and have this lecture today on this land. Today's lecture, Natural Architecture and Archaeology of the Future, is the first of two public Gehry Chair events, and we hope that the second will take place in person during winter term. Named in honor of Toronto-born designer Frank O. Gehry, this endowed chair brings a highly recognized international architect to the Daniels faculty to deliver a public lecture and enrich the student learning experience each year. A special thank you to Heather Reesian and the 45 generous donors who established the chair in 2000 under the leadership of Professor Emeritus and former Dean Larry Wayne Richards. This is the 20th year that we've been rewarded with the educational and cultural benefits of this endowed position, and we're grateful and honored to have Lina Ghotmeh join us as our new Gehry Chair. Now, as a student, I remember being really moved by a quote from Rafael Moneo, where he explains how the site is the ground, the earth in which the roots of a building are planted, and is to be considered as the inevitable first material for any construction. He goes on to say, I believe that learning to listen to the murmur of the site is one of the most necessary experiences in an architectural education. To discern what should be kept, what could permeate from the previously existing site into the new presence, and emerge after the substantial immobile artifact is built, is crucial for any architect. Understanding what is to be ignored, subtracted, erased, added, transformed from the existing conditions of the site is fundamental to the practice of architecture. I'm so excited that Lina is with us as colleague and educator this year. Her work expertly listens to the site, its history, materials, and memories. Whether in rural or urban settings, Lina's projects build upon the site ecologically and sustainably, expressing the close relationship of nature and building, celebrating local craft and innovative techniques into what she calls an archaeology of the future. Lina has lectured internationally, including at École Spéciale d'Architecture and the Yale School of Architecture, and is leading a year-long research studio for our MArch students here at the Daniels faculty. She is co-president of the RST Arches Scientific Network and the recipient of multiple awards, including recently the 2020 Tamayu's Woman of Outstanding Achievement Award and the 2019 French Fine Arts Academy Cardin Award. Today, we'll learn more about projects that find context in difficult pasts, such as the Estonian National Museum and Stone Garden in Beirut. And I'm looking forward to hearing Dean Du join us and Lina in conversation following her lecture. Now, please join me in welcoming Lina.
Thank you so much, Vivian, for this introduction, and thank you, Dean Juan, to also be here and for receiving me for such a lecture. And I'm really honored to be occupying the Frank O. Gehry chair this year, and really excited. The studio has been really very inspiring since the start, and it's really great to be able to share with you some of the methodology of the work that I did in my office, but also to open the discussion and nourish that work through your own insights, actually. So I'll try to share my screen, and open the presentation. So if I may start, so basically I would like to talk about the methodology of work in my practice in Paris, where it's a research-based method of work. It's also a kind of in-depth kind of what I call archaeology, but it's also a way of work that we're trying to develop together with the studio at Toronto at the moment. So it's interesting also to share that. I know some of the students are listening now to this lecture. And like the quest is always multimedia, thematic, and there's always in the studio this kind of combination of photography, of inspirations, of theoretical works, of imagery, sketches, models, material making. So it's kind of like a crossing of different processes, different media that actually like accumulate and work together towards the shaping of a project. And in a way, every project starts with a question, and there is always this question that drives us to dig and research into what would be actually an architectural form that questions the site, that opens for new possibilities. This happens through a lengthy process that is both handmade and that is digitally made. So we keep on working by hand, trying to test the material, test the spaces through models. As we do and as the hand works, it informs us and it transforms actually the spaces that we try to shape. In the same way that still the sketches do that in that matter. So talking about questioning a space, it's also looking at its origin, going back to what gave rise to a certain typology, how it developed through time, and how what does it actually, how does it impact our buildscape, how does it impact our social relationship, and how can we what can we learn from all this transformation and evolution, and how can we intervene through almost looking down, unveiling, digging into a place and unveiling what it has to say. So this is in a way parallel to an archaeological process, and maybe also it's related to the place where I had grown up, Beirut, which was constantly after the war an open archaeology, because many of the buildings were destroyed, but also reconstruction was happening. And every reconstruction was unveiling a whole city or history underneath, where we could see the story of Phoenicians, of Ottomans, of Romans that had passed in that city, and all multi-layered with different temporalities that are happening within the same plot or same cityscape. At the same time, it informed on the presence of nature in the city. It, in a way, nature was able to always come and invade the derelict spaces, and giving, in a certain way, beauty despite all the destruction that had happened to the city. So it played not only in a way, showed us how the power of organic nature to be there in a buildscape or in a left out construction, but also its power to kind of bring beauty in every spot of the city. It's a kind of like what one of my students called now accidental sustainability, which is this kind of growing of nature all alone, or like devising some kind of solutions for issues that we're facing out of the lack of resources. Some also photos of Beirut houses that were quite inspiring for me and do inspire my work. These the celebration, constant celebration of spaces that we see in some of the houses that were built in the Ottoman period, where we have these staircases that just are there for the experience of them, and where like a tree can just be there inhabiting that staircase and be part of an architecture. So all these kind of thoughts constitute like a tree or life, like a tree life, basically, that orchestrates the way we produce architecture out of this complex terrain, actually, of researches and different thematics that have to, in a way, constitute an evidence and give rise to an emergence on a site. So architecture will never be like an object that just sits in a place, but it's an element that is unveiled. It's a realm that talks about what had been there, but in a completely original way. And that opens up for appropriation. And it's where the program is never just a fixed element, but is an opening towards evolution and transformation with time. So it is a domain that is situated between archaeology, humanity, nature, and the future. Archaeology as paralleling like the quest in history, the digging, humanity or humaneness, the inclusiveness of architecture, nature as it's nurturing what we do, and the future as it is evoking a finding. So every project has, in a way, attempts to bring all these notions together in a simple shape or inhabitable shape. So archaeology as the research of the past, of place, of stories, unearthing these and projecting them into a future as where architecture becomes an emergence. So I had, in a way, throughout the years of my practice, worked in very specific places, accidentally probably, or maybe I was drawn to these places, what I would call post-apocalyptic landscapes. So one of them was the Estonian National Museum, in the sense that the context of that project that was situated in Tartu in Estonia. So this is the cultural capital of Estonia, which and Estonia is a country that had lived the Soviet occupation for years and that had gained its independence in 91, that had struggled also for the construction of a certain identity that is, of course, multiple identity, very much influenced from the agriculture, and who wanted, through that construction of a museum, a national museum, to respond to constitute actually a place where they continue to collect, but also to respond to the question of what is an identity and how can a museum be a place that is open in its identity and that constitutes a place of life, an incubator of culture. What was interesting in that site, and of course this project was also a competition that was an open competition that I participated in with two colleagues in 2006, and the site itself was a site also that talked about the history of Estonia, about the like peasants also culture of Estonia, all these objects that gained their importance because of the narrative that Estonians were able to articulate around these objects, wooden objects, but also the tight relationship with the landscape that this project had to draw, and with an architecture that exists already on the landscape. This is one of the houses of famous textile artists, Estonian textile artists. But the work that she does actually shows some of the works that were done by Estonians during the occupation time that was also contributing to the persistence and the continuity of their identities through the work of the hand. And the site itself of that museum was positioned in a very particular place. It's one of the largest military airfields in Estonia. Of course, in the brief itself of the competition, there was no mention of that history, that military airfield, because it constituted a negative history for Estonians. So they were more wanting to have an icon of a museum that really draw them into almost like forgetting what had been there and looking at the future. But looking at that, it was essential to treat this trace on the site and to look at what had happened actually on that site. That was a place where manifestations could happen, where Estonians were manifesting for their independence. So it had a lot of it had a lot of history in it, and had borne a lot of significance for the Estonians. And yet also this airfield was this kind of continuous ground that was there and that reminded us of all these drawings of Super Studio, this continuous monument of dystopian thinking, like how this kind of continuous spaces existed in the city or in here at the fringes of the city, and how to transform these, reappropriate them, and give them another future. So hence the idea of going out of the site that was given to the competition and of bringing the museum in kind of connection to that airfield and giving it almost a territorial scale, a land art signifier, or like a role of urban regenerator, where in a way this platform becomes part of the museum and becomes a place where the identity can continuously be constructed for Estonians. So the museum sits on the ground and just raises itself and dives into the landscape, and in a way becomes a platform for people to intervene on, to work on, but also to continuously produce their own culture. So it's a place that took also the time for construction, and as it emerged almost like an archaeology on the site. It dialogued also with the poetics yet military aspect of that site. And when we looked at all the program inside, we were looking at the scale and thinking how to disintegrate the mass of that building and dialogue with the city itself, and bringing the scale of these houses of the city back into the heart of the museum to give it a humane aspect. So you see this kind of large cantilever that kind of go down from 14 meters into 3 meters to invite visitors inside. So the building is playing also with this generosity of spaces. So beyond the program itself, offering spaces of encounters, spaces that are not necessarily programmed, and what I call uncertain spaces, spaces where other activities could happen because of the dimension, because of the situation of these spaces, and that happen between the different functions, like the boutique, or this kind of generosity of space that plays with the light. And then as we move to this bridge area that is an open space that of course was a lot of discussion with the client whether we should have it or not, because it's like a generous space, but there's no function. But today it's a place where they do performances, where they actually have the most freedom and expression in that museum. So it's also a place where they do these concerts and different public manifestations. All the inside of the building was custom made with local materials and techniques. And it's now a place for education where students come and actually work, spend their days. And as we move basically through the building, we reach this other entrance. And that was also the challenge of the building, because in a way, a museum has only one entrance conventionally as a program. And here, because of the configuration of the site, it was essential to develop the typology further and to offer 2 entrances and exits. And in a way, it opened also the the reading of the collection itself. So one could enter from here and read the collection in a complete different timeline. So offering also a multiplicity of narrative of the museum collection. The envelope of the building itself is all made with this pattern, which is this typical flower that was always used for knitting and for textile work by women. It's also symbolizing the resistance and resilience of Estonians during the different times of occupations. And it is after in the architecture itself, it starts to constitute the gown of the building and the body of it. So this is how we see the building disappearing actually and playing both monumentality, but at the same time, a capacity to disappear and disintegrate in the landscape. And this is just a photo of a concert that happened on the airfield of Metallica. I didn't know actually they still exist as a band, but yeah, I mean, like the whole airfield was full with people, and they invaded the whole museum basically with that concert. Talking about also issues that we have to deal with, like the climate issue, and how do we actually, after climate crisis, how do we deal through it, and how do we answer that through architecture, is one project that we are working on in Paris. And this is a project that is developed in response to the city's call for innovative projects that would be able to respond to climate change, to the changes and mutability of programs. And actually, like that project was on a site in the 13th of Paris. They didn't give us any program, only a site. So as architects, we had to develop a whole program about the project and an architecture, get the users, get the developer, and constitute and orchestrate a whole team for the architecture of that building. And the subject that we decided to deal with was sustainable feeding and the waste actually that is linked to food, and thinking also that food is the first relationship that we build with our planet. So if we eat in a much more sustainable way, we also have a much sustainable relationship to our environment. So we started thinking about a building that would be orchestrated around the subject of sustainable feeding, that would be located in Paris, really close to this little belt that crosses Paris, and that is completely left out, derelict today in the city, and that had been overgrown by nature. And thinking of a building almost like a painting of Archimboldo, where all its constituents are parts that could completely disintegrate. Talking about sustainable feeding and all the different relations of food, where you can have a place where you plant, where you research, innovate, share, and recycle. So even the architecture of that project was driven by this circular economy, where all these different spaces are interrelated, where you could have a place where you plant, but then you crop, then you transmit, and you relate to, with the community, and then again compost. So all these interrelated spaces. And an architecture where also the floors are interrelated in a way, fostering for interaction between the different levels, in a way countering what we have been doing in the last lessons with the stacking of different floors, trying to foster interaction and relationship, moments of surprise through the spaces that we can develop. And also thinking about how to integrate resources, like natural resources, as part of the shape of that building, but also as how to collect water, have a place that could be sustainable in that sense. This is like illustrating the ramps and where people could meet over the ramps. And building with wood, of course, in Canada, we know that very well, like it's a sustainable resource. In France, we're really new in building high rises, at least this is like 50 meters, not so much of a high rise, but the highest we can go at the moment in France in wood construction. And it stocks carbon, so it reduces its carbon footprint on its environment. And also thinking about construction in a way that is assemblable, disassemblable as well. So the material is always a resource. There's no waste. Everything is recycled, reused, whether it's water or the way we will basically design the spaces inside by involving the community and thinking of a more fluid design, a place that can evolve in its architecture as well. Model is an important tool. For example, in this competition, when I was submitting it, the jury was very perplexed on its architecture because it's quite complex, all these ramps and the relationship. So the model really helped to relay how the different levels interrelate and what kind of mood we can imagine in these spaces. And all the relationship with the environment. And here we can see like one of the housing, which is like a small housing unit. And the fact that this building is a lively place that lives like during the night as well. So another project that we just really realized in Beirut. So this is dealing with a city that had been like living different cataclysm and still doing that or living that at the moment too, unfortunately. But just here to show like a brief oversight on the research that we lead, like that is only part actually of what contributes and what is behind a project. And every time, every project is this kind of accumulation of critical research where we try to find the thematic that we want to explore in a project and through an architecture. So this building is really by the port of Beirut that had lived the blast on the last year in August. And it talks also about Beirut, the city that has been completely reconstructed and over-constructed also with this encroachment of concrete on the waterfront. But that also, in a way, is a constant laboratory of construction and of life and of contradictions. And in a way, through contradiction, we constantly see innovation and different ways to inhabit spaces, which are always inspiring in this incremental or tactical, let's say, urbanism, where there were never like one master plan that was really realized for Beirut, and it's always patches of different visions that are constructed. And then at the same time, it's a place that portrays the crisis that we are living in the world, where we are lacking housing for many people. And how do we deal with that? How do we deal with these moments of crises, but also with the story, like how to bring history back into our understanding of today and a critique of today as well. So the site of that project is by the port, and it's also an old factory of concrete. And the building is like taking place in place of that old factory. And it's a site that belongs to a photographer and his family who inherited that site from their father, who was a very known modernist architect. And his name is Fouad El-Khoury. And Fouad El-Khoury, with like other photographers like Raymond Depardon, Gabriel Basilico, Roberto Burri, and others, have gone to Beirut in '92 and have taken a series of photography of Beirut city center. Beirut city center that today had almost disappeared because, I mean, it was reconstructed, but the memory of that center with what it had lived after the war had been completely erased after the reconstruction. And they had these like very strong photos of that part of Beirut where we see these frail buildings, and in a parallel way, these bodies that of people that really resemble these buildings, making one think about the relationship of our bodies to the environment and how we actually, the way we behave in space really resembles and is inflicted by the spaces that surround us. So raising awareness of the role of architecture actually to question the environment and to provoke alternatives or critiques or different possibilities of inhabiting. So the building talks about photography, about framing the city differently as well, bringing Beirut as a different, in a different viewpoint to the inhabitants, because it's a residential building, but also allowing the window to become a device to critique and to kind of look differently to the city. And the process of construction resembled in many ways, actually, the way the city had been destructed, and we have this kind of heightened materiality that was rising, echoing also all the traces that one sees in the city, like because of many destructions and reconstructions that are happening. And the power of the ruin to constantly evoke the imagination and open the imagination, but also to encompass nature in a much more organic and lively way. So for me, like the question was how to integrate nature also as part of the construction of that building, in a way talking about the different scales of nature and how the different scales of nature could be also a way to draw a residential space, but also to draw the relationship between the inside and the outside, allowing also to change the typology of the housing units. Since, as we saw before in some of the photos, Beirut was living this kind of high rises that multiply the same building and housing typology over and over, dictating also the same social construct, the same way of living in each of the buildings. The project also echoes vernacular architecture. Like when we were researching through the vernacular architecture in Lebanon, it was always, because it's a Mediterranean climate, it's always like very modest openings to the outside, keeping a thermal mass, keeping the relationship to more subtle relationship to the environment. Like we barely have, if we have to think about it, a glass skyscraper in a Mediterranean climate where it's plus 35 in summertime is an aberrance for the environment. So how can we measure our opening and yet have a generous relationship to the outside? I like this photo because we can see this also relationship that people have to the outside in such climates, where the sidewalk is really part of the private realm, and people just sit outside, chat, and have their life in that context. And also the skin of the building is a tool to kind of evoke emotions, but also talk about the anchorage of a building within its context, and also talk about it as an emergence that comes from the ground. I wanted also to work with local crafts. In Beirut, a lot of the workers on site are coming from Syria, from different countries because of the wars that are happening. and how to empower the artisans and have them part of the making and part of the almost creative process. And we started testing actually these finishes, and I drew a comb and they manufactured it on the scale of the building. And this all started actually also in the office with these tests, and then after became like an experiment on the scale of a building, where the artisans projected that mix that we created with mortar and sand and earth, and then chiseled the whole building. And they were really part of the creative process because they were thinking with me like how to actually arrive technically to execute that texture. And we were like doing all these combs, almost like combing a body actually in the city. So we can see these moments also where the building is able to morph, to relate to its context, to change shape, and to be maybe more than a cubic building, be amorphous structures that tries to dialogue with the context, to talk about urban regulations as well. Because as we know, we have these kind of lines that shape the buildings, and sometimes they can be absurd. And the apartments inside, they we can see how nature is within them, and how also, for example, this is like a window to the outside. It looks like a painting within the building. Of course, it's a housing for a certain more, let's say, medium class population. So it was also how to, in a way, give something to the city, even if it's how, like I'm having a client to build with not social housing, but this type of housing, but how to have a building that really tries to give something to the city also. One of the elements also, or the programs that is articulated in that building, is a center for the image in the Middle East. And it's a place where, and the platform where photography, art is exhibited, and talks about also the questions in that region. And the idea is also to keep that space really kind of unfinished, so always open for the imagination. So we see here like how this project from this side looks like the section of the buildings close by. And after the blast, in a way, the building remained like building's architecture remained almost intact. So the skin was there, the nature was there. And maybe at that point, I realized that maybe I had drawn a bunker because it's of the situation in Beirut. So you have this like contrast also that had happened between the context and where we feel like we're in the 80s here, and this building is a collage within that mixed temporality situation. So the project at the moment is exhibited at the Biennale in Venice. And here actually the idea was to reproduce the project in a scaled model, 1:30 model, but specifically to talk about the process, but also exhibit the creative field that Beirut constitutes through the interiors scenography of that model. So we could discover movies narrating the city, but also photographies that are taken by many artists in Beirut that talk about the landscape of that city, but also about these kind of left out like houses that are awaiting to be reconstructed, but that inspire many creatives, talking about the process of making as an inherent process of architecture. I think I'm on 1840. Maybe if we can start the conversation now, or
As you prefer, Lina, would you like to show one more project, or I'd be happy to start our conversation already.
Yeah, I think that will be great.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
then I can actually respond through showing other projects as well. So it could be also
Right.
much more dynamic. So
Yeah. Okay, great. So thank you, Lina, for the sharing with us your projects and also the thought process that went into it. It had occurred to me as you were showing these three projects that there is this issue of tension in all of the projects of you had entitled your talk today as the archaeology of the future, that there is this tension between the past and the future. And in the Beirut housing tower, it is at once ancient and modern. There's something really unique about this architecture you have created, and the way that I think has really touched people in looking, either looking at photographs of the building or visiting it inside. And I very much appreciate the way you started to speak about the city through the works of the photography and photographers of the city post the 2020 explosion, which was such a tragic event that really had resonance all over the world. I mean, I was teaching in Hong Kong, and right after the explosion of the port, even, I had thesis students in Hong Kong, at the University of Hong Kong, who wanted to do their thesis on Beirut, and who wanted to demonstrate and explore if there was ways for architectural design to acknowledge what had happened and also to contribute to the city.
Yeah.
So I find it a very meaningful project, and I want to congratulate you for having created a project that is highly sensitive to the historical moment also that you were working on at the project at the city. So it's really a fantastic project that seems to
Thank you so much.
It seems to very much fit into the local context in terms of the material, the scale, the openings, and making sure that it is one singular volume, but that singular volume had texture and it had aggregates that can relate to its context. So it very much stands out on its own, but it also feels like very much a natural extension of the history of that particular neighborhood and that particular city. So I want to commend you on the project, and as they have received many of the design awards and then attention as it should, but I want to actually highlight that I would imagine it was also an emotional project to work on because of that. Because of that historical moment and that emotional challenge of what we do as designers and architects, I think perhaps doesn't come through so obviously through, say, the exhibition in Venice or even photography of the work. I think this is something perhaps, a conversation emerges out of that. So I would just like to perhaps for you just to maybe talk a little bit about that aspect of your process and both the creative process of the project, but also the implementation, execution of the project on site in this post-traumatic context. Because, I'll tell you why I think this could be a very interesting conversation and knowledge for our students, because we are living in an age where there's a lot of challenges around us, whether it's the environmental, the social, the political, and economic. And there has been a rising skepticism, and I think a healthy one, of how much could architecture, how much could design, how much could planning, how much could how much could kind of in particular the design knowledge and practice, how much can we really do, and what is within the possibilities of what we can do and what is outside of it. And you know, I very much appreciated this kind of local crafts and the photographs you were showing of the craftsmen working on the facade and such. So it's, to me, it would be really interesting to hear you speak further about the process of design, the process of construction and making, the process of you know, the residents moving in, and in which ways you think, as a practitioner and as a designer, you have contributed, and perhaps in which ways you thought there was limitations of what we can do, and perhaps there could be a desire to hint at how we can break through those limitations.
Yeah, thank you so much for these questions and comments. They're really like so sensitive and so like relevant to what I'm trying to explore and show. Yeah, it's a very good question. In the way how do we deal with this kind of moment that we are living in, which is constantly calling on post-trauma, but it's also like new opportunities also opening, not in an opportunistic way, but new ways of doing are possible through also the critique that we can have on our environment. Now, the project of Beirut, this building is a 10 years work. So I started that project in 2010 and almost realized that, like, was trying to deliver it just on the day, like on the time actually when the explosion happened. So 2020, like last year, was the moment where I really completed all the exterior, the interior spaces that you see in the photos of actually Iwan Ban. And then the explosion happened, and the only trace that we had of that project finished were these photos that were taken just a bit earlier than the blast. And the thing is that it reflects not only on the situation of the explosion, which really very much portrays the situation of Beirut. It reflects on all these situations that the city is living constantly, and that the blast really emphasize in a certain way and spatialize, because it is a city that is constantly living in such a traumatic event. There no public governance. It had lived the war. The institutions are dismantled. So it is constantly in fabrication, and in that actually. What is interesting is in such situations, when we are in a context that lives the trauma or is in constant process of trauma, it's a place that of heightened contradictions, where there are always different dynamics happening, and allowing us always to question things and to be able to find other tools of making and create other spaces. And that's what becomes for me interesting in these contexts, is really to first listen and try to understand the mechanisms of making, and try to think of what do these mechanisms of making that are very much on ground, that are very much linked to the people, to a micro scale of making, because innovation happens through these micro interventions of people, of transformations of left out building, or of kind of very vernacular constructions that happen in the mountains, or of resilient ways of dealing with a event. And then you can see people occupying spaces very much differently than how we urbanize until now, and we think of major cities and much more kind of a planned top-down relationship, like homogeneous. And that for me started to be very interesting as a way of looking at another way of making also through the organic, through like having nature part of architecture as an organic life, but also as encompassing in a way other living organisms, but also of looking at the hand rather than at a larger standard and in the industrialized processes. So I think like to question how can we intervene in such landscapes, and are we able, actually, do we have the tools? I think our first tool as architects is our thought process and our critical thinking. We have the capacity of looking at things, of analyzing the spaces, of trying to understand what are the dynamics that are behind the creation of certain ways of making of our spaces. The second is our sensitivity, actually, to our environment, material sensitivity. And in these moments, there are like very heightened situation of materiality, of where waste is all over. And these moments question, actually, what is waste? What can be waste? How can we, how can we build when we're surrounded with waste? And we are surrounded with waste, even if we don't see it in cities like Paris, because we have to think about waste as a resource, as a way, as another resource to building, to think about materiality, also about the organicity of what happens after a traumatic escape. And I think this is the first also approach, is sometimes looking at that, mapping these, understanding the ground, trying to record this in-betweenness that happens when a traumatic event starts to unfolds, whether this kind of explosion, but sometimes also when we're talking about the climate, for example. There's a very interesting book that I just bought. It's a French book. It's called Terra Forma, and it's all about mapping the devising maps that map the living world, basically mapping the trees, mapping the organic life, actually, and devising different geographies and different maps that allow us to read our environment. And that is also another tool that allows different making before even intervening in space, because the intervention is a long, let's say it's a longer process. And then the intervention itself, or like the spatial act or the physical act, can be an act that could raise a question, a critique that can allow for another opening to the way to inhabit, that can shed a light, actually, to a certain situation in the world through the way it, in an original way, manifests itself as a space. It could be a community work as well. It can empower the community through the work of the hand, through the creative process. Sorry, I'm so long. This is a really long subject.
No, it's a conversation, but thank you for that. In speaking, there's 2 points I want to touch upon. One is this post-traumatic response or intervention, architectural act as a post-traumatic response or intervention, and also this issue of our relationship to the nature and what we do. On this first one, it occurred to me as you were speaking is that the first project you showed us, the Estonia National Museum, in many ways is also a post-traumatic project, right? It is in the historic town, the city of Tartu, but the site itself is a former site of a Soviet military airstrip that was, spoke about a period of occupation. I'm not sure if colonialization is the term, but definitely an occupation. And the project, it's a beautiful project in how restrained it is, and it is both very restrained but yet very monumental. Mm-hmm. So I could, from your talk today, but also from my previous knowledge of this project in Tartu, it is, and I'm sure it was also an emotional project to create, right? That how do we show in a museum, how do we design spaces and design a museum that record and reflects the entire history, that has moments of ancient knowledge and history, but also of war and destruction and a process of rebuilding, and kind of, and yet at the same time, for it to be very much forward-looking and optimistic, and the way the kind of the linear formal design that followed the dimension, the airstrip, but through section, it creates a kind of a very much a new possibility for us to understand that landscape, and that relationship to the surroundings. So for me, when we were speaking about the framing of the city in Beirut, I saw a continuation of that interest in the Estonia National Museum project, that in the end, it is, it's almost like a project that's coming from an abandoned landscape, and it became its own landscape, right? And reframing towards the future. Yeah, so that's something that I had recognized. But I do want then my next point, and perhaps for you to speak further about, is this relationship of, say, architecture, environment, and nature. It seems that within the tools, as you mentioned, of what architects or what design could do to reflect and contribute to these very complex processes, occupation, explosion, etc. Food shortage and issues of sustainability in Paris, where you have an increasingly gentrified city, where there's such a drastic division of socioeconomic class of the city, of the relations between the city and the banlieue, and that in some ways is, I think, also it is a crisis as well of the city. I think I had lived and worked in Paris for 3 years, and I had in some ways experienced that process, and it was the beginning. This is in the mid 2000s, and there was a kind of beginning awareness that something is really wrong, there's something not right. And when the riots was happening in the peripheries, in the banlieues, that is an issue of urban planning and design and architecture. It's very much related to that, and the repercussions and the long-term impacts, I think, is what we have witnessed in the riots, but still continuing in the city. So I'm curious, for the second project you showed us, of this very optimistic project of bringing back into the city these very basic relationships through food, through agriculture, through what I noticed was this idea of a continuous ground, right? Going from the street, from the sidewalks, and continue up vertically. So I was curious how much of that project was your reflection, or is your reflection of the ongoing process of the city in Paris, where your office is working out of.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, this is one, like a major issue that the city is living through, especially also even more at the moment, where the city wants to tend towards a car-free city, and which basically poses a problem for many people that are living in the suburb, and makes it even more close. But the issue of the building, yes, I mean, the question is, this is also a neighborhood, specifically this 13th neighborhood is a very interesting neighborhood, because it's a junction of multiple cultures and multiple people with different origins.
It's the 13th arrondissement is where Chinatown is, right?
Yes, and there's also like a lot of Arab communities, French, different different really people, and we are close to Ivry, to the kind of really to the belt actually of out the peripheries of Paris. So the building is really at the junction between the whole development that is being led in the 30s, where a lot of new high rises are rising, and kind of a gentrified neighborhood, and the peripheries, and trying also to kind of work on that junction and materialize that junction spatially too, through these ramps and through the fact of being an open building in its in its architecture, that is not like a cube, it's not closed, and it tries to open up to the outside through these balconies, through these openings, but also to be a lovable element in its surrounding, in a way to bring people together into a place where they would feel good also to be there. The development of the program that I orchestrated also with the team, like different professionals, was also a subject that had to respond to that, because the question of feeding and food and the cooking and agriculture is essential to bring people together. Food is universal. Everyone eats, everyone wants to cook, and it throws a place for the different communities that are living around to come and experiment, cook, and have kitchen, planting and cooking as an act of community making also within that building. The last thing, during the process of conception of that project, also of design, we did a lot of work on ground, meeting with the associations of the neighborhood and trying to think, to present the project, but also to incorporate their needs and to see how the project is being apprehended and looked upon by the neighbors. And is it a place where they would feel comfortable to appropriate? Because it's a very much social neighborhood with a lot of social housing that are very close to that project as well. So some of them wanted more like a boulangerie, like a bakery, and that's what was interesting in this project. It's really born by these relationships that we try to listen to and incorporate in the architecture and the program.
Great. Thank you, Lina. There are some student questions in the audience, and I'm just going to ask everyone's patience, perhaps for 5 minutes, to read one to you. So this particular one, the residential project in Beirut is lovely, seems very sensitive to local craft materials and even climate, with my knowledge of Beirut being from there. This is from Dana. Hi, Dana, from Beirut. It really is so complementary to the urban landscape at large. So that is a compliment to the project. And the question is, to what extent did the robust and ever-changing environment in Beirut influence your wider practice with other projects, if at all? What can we take from designing for or within such an environment to apply elsewhere?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very good question, Dana. I think basically Beirut, as I tried to convey in my presentation, made me look at space differently. And also coming to France afterwards, I started being aware of a different relation to my environment that I had in Beirut, that I critically was able to underline when I'm living in Paris, like this organicity of the city, this constant kind of tactical construction, constant at-risk moments, appropriation of spaces or detouring of the functions of spaces. Like, for example, working on the project of Masséna, for me, it was natural to think of a project program from scratch. Like, yes, it's possible, actually. We don't have to have a program because nothing is inscribed, so everything is able to move and change. So it allows you a kind of mindset that is interesting to confront with other contexts, which is that of the also flexibility of regulation, which can be dangerous too in Beirut itself, because the lack and absence of any regulation and any law is also the source of complete chaos.
Mhm.
But if you have the social responsibility as an individual to act positively on your environment, then that could be a driver also of like a change in a much faster way. These are two opposite like ends that could be sometimes dangerous to one another.
Great. Well, Lina, I thank you for giving us our first Gehry lecture of the year. I look forward to seeing you later this month. And also look forward to the second installment of your lecture. Hopefully we can do it in person and hosting the students physically as well. When you do come, hopefully our exhibition is still up. We had our first exhibition of the year, and the title is called "How 10 Questions on the Future of Advocacy and Change." So it is an exhibition of some selected thesis projects from last year in architecture, forestry, landscape architecture, urban design, and visual studies. And it echoes, I think, how you opened your presentation with us today, that you said for you, every project begins with a question. And I want to reinforce that for our students, that, you know, the importance of being able to ask the right questions and to consider the creative process and design process that we do as a way to answer some of these questions out there. So thank you so much, Lina.
Thank you so much.
And I want to close just by letting everyone know that the next event of our fall public program is called Robots as Companions, and that's next Thursday, October 21st at 6:30 p.m. So, but this has been a really fantastically interesting conversation, at least for me, Lina.
Thank you so much.
And I look forward to our continuing dialogue throughout this year. So thanks to all the outreach team for organizing this. Thanks, Vivian, for having coordinated this talk, and the visiting chair as well. And thanks to all of the audience we have for joining us online, which then is almost 200, just so you know. I was able to get that number. So really fantastic. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye.